right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Star. I am an enrolled citizen of Kitigan-Zibi Anishinabek, which is a First Nation up in Canada. Whenever I'm presenting in Maine, I like to make it really clear that I am from a non-Wabanaki community. I'm actually from an Algonquin community up in Canada. I grew up in southern Maine. I'm a graduate of the Portland Public School System. I am also a former social studies teacher um, and the current curator of education at the Abbey Museum, which is a museum dedicated to Wabanaki history, culture, art, and an institution that is establishing decolonizing practice within the museum sphere for a more equitable and collaborative work with Wabanaki nations. And before delving into the content of my presentation, I really wanted to take a moment at the beginning to recognize the 20th anniversary of the Wabanaki Studies Law. And I want to acknowledge the amount of forethought, labor, and energy that went into the creation of the Wabanaki Studies Law, and thank Donna Loring and Donald Soktoma for their part in the creation of this law. I also want to thank the countless other Wabanaki people that have dedicated their lives and careers to the support of this law and its implementation of it throughout the state. Many I've been really fortunate enough to work with, to know, and to learn from personally. And in reflecting on 20 years, I was thinking that I was actually in middle school down in Portland when this law was passed. And I really regret that I never had a chance in my public education to learn Wabanaki studies. But 20 years later, we all know that there's still so much work to do. And it's my hope that in the work I do at the Abbey, that I can help lift some of the burden and responsibility to carry this law into full practice throughout the state. I also, after listening to Donna's address this morning, I really want to thank her for her words and her encouragement to be committed to truth telling, because that's a really big part of my work. And that's a big part of what we're going to be doing in my session today. So I wanted to thank her for that and giving me courage, because I was a little bit nervous talking to a group of teachers about some really difficult content and some really difficult conversations that we have to talk about. Before going any further, I do want to read the Abbey's land acknowledgement. We are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all of the Native communities who have lived here for thousands of generations in what is now known today as Maine, New England, and the Canadian Maritimes. We make this acknowledgement aware of the continual violations of water, territorial rights, and sacred sites in the Wabanaki homeland. The Abbey is honored to collaborate with the Wabanaki as they share their stories. If you have questions about land acknowledgements, I usually have a whole spiel that I'm going to cut from my talk, but please do reach out. But I want to make sure that I do let you know that if you're interested in developing any kind of land acknowledgement, that you know that a land acknowledgement in and of itself is not decolonization, and that it's a much smaller piece of a very big framework. So for today's presentation, I really wanted to give you some solid building blocks that you can use as a foundation in a much larger endeavor to prepare you for decolonization and teaching Wabanaki studies. Just as with anti-racist teaching, decolonized teaching really takes a lot of personal education and work. You know, you've grown up in a settler colonial state, and it has been normalized to you, and it will take time for you to learn about how about settler colonialism, how you to recognize it and all its shapes and forms, and how, of course, to approach Wabanaki studies in your classroom through a decolonized and anti-racist pedagogical approach. So these are the topics that I hope to cover in the time that we have. We're going to cover settler colonialism, honestly, just the basics though. There are whole courses that you could take over an entire semester just on settler colonialism. But I also want to look at empire building, um, building a toolkit for yourself, and then of course, reviewing a couple resources that I think are really helpful. And that I have used and that I still use today. And in my next slides, I want to help you unpack settler colonialism so that you will be better equipped to bring more Wabanaki content into your classrooms. I'll share what settler colonialism looks like in our lives, how it functions, the narratives that are prevalent in our communities that normalize it, and also unpack how I I dealt with a very colonial curriculum while I was teaching. So we can't begin to decolonize curriculums unless we first are ready to understand settler colonialism, what it is, how it's normalized and functioning around us, and how does it show up in our curriculum. As with anti-racist work, decolonizing work must start with you as an educator, your education, and your pedagogical approach. Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And I'm going to repeat that just because it is a little bit different than other forms of colonialism that you may have studied in other parts of the world. So settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And this is definitely just an intro to settler colonialism, which might be new to many of you to really understand the land in which you work and live on. And it requires people to be really critical of the power structures that have been built over time in this hemisphere. And it's not always an easy, simple conversation. There aren't always one answer to all the questions that we have, but it's definitely important that we get started thinking about these really important topics. So what are some of the characteristics of settler colonialism and how does it differ from other colonialism which has been present throughout the world? The first characteristic is replacement. In a settler colonial society, we see a deliberate attempt to replace indigenous populations, government, authority with other colonial counterparts. In other parts of the world that have been colonized historically, formal and physical occupation of the land and government have been returned to indigenous peoples. Of course, there's always the caveat to all to varying degrees, right? Colonial legacies around the world are still definitely felt. And especially if we are looking at economic structures in places like Africa and Asia, you can definitely see the legacies and the continued colonial legacy within other parts of the world. But a really big part of what makes settler colonialism distinct from other forms of colonialism is this replacement. Another key aspect of settler colonialism is that it is a structure and not an event. This is not one point in time. This is not just one event, and instead it's a system that has been created and still exists within the United States. And that brings us to our next point, is that settler colonialism still exists today. And I can't say this enough, colonialism in the United States, in Canada, and Australia still exists. The occupation of this land has never ended. The next key aspect of settler colonialism is extraction. Settler colonialism is characterized by extractive practices, including the removal of indigenous peoples from their lands for the sole purpose of acquiring more land for the colonial sovereign, extraction of resources from the land, for example, the taking of land for the use of agriculture, mining, logging, drilling, And there's a close connection between extraction and natural exploitation for the benefit of the settler colonial state. And this really comes down to the accumulation of wealth from the land itself. Colonial models of wealth really depend on the continual accumulation of resources, um, and authority to exert decision making over the land. And this is why indigenous sovereignty is continually under attack by the settler colonial state. And the fight for the land has never ended and is still ongoing to this day. Another characteristic that it's really important to understand about settler colonialism is that it's always expanding. And just because American colonization has reached the West Coast, right, does not mean that it has ended. And instead, we must consider the taking of lands and territories um, beyond just the continental US and looking at territories such as Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii, as a continued effort to colonize and accumulate wealth. I also hope that you'd be really comfortable in considering uh, the taking of resources and land on behalf of corporations as part of contemporary settler colonialism, especially when those corporations are based in the United States and other colonial nations. As you start to consider what settler colonialism is and how it functions today, I really encourage you to think about the various narratives that are used to justify the continued colonization of this land. And here I'm providing you with some examples of these narratives, and I hope to make it clear that these are really everywhere. And yes, they're in our classrooms, but they're also within our national parks. They're at historic sites, they're on interpretive panels, they're within museums, public monuments, government buildings, and even in place names. The first narrative I want to go over is that of Terranolius, which is the perception that lands in long-term use by indigenous peoples are empty or unused. Settler colonialism proceeds to carve up indigenous-held lands into discrete pockets of private property. And this is really important, especially within the American context of thinking about the importance of private property and the taking of lands throughout this nation. And it goes under this guise of, quote, they aren't using the land in virtuous or productive ways, therefore it's open for exploitation. Farming and resource extraction are seen as the best uses of land, and this of course doesn't account for indigenous understandings of land, nor does it account for indigenous use of land. Another really important narrative often used in a settler colonial state is that of the, quote unquote, savage, the savage archetype. This is an archetype that is a dehumanizing way of viewing indigenous peoples as, an archetype which is a dehumanizing view of indigenous people, which supports that parallel narrative of peaceful, adventurous, and virtuous settlement. And Columbus writes in his earliest accounts of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, and he writes about the noble and ignoble savage, each label depending on, how quote unquote amendable he saw indigenous people to be to enslavement and colonization. And it really set up an entire power imbalance and an entire structure in this hemisphere. And through his writing, he really had the power to name, to classify, and to establish this new colonial structure within the Americas. And I really invite you to consider other racialized archetypes that have been used and are still used today to justify the development of lands, the building of infrastructure and resource extraction. There are a lot of archetypes around Blackness, archetypes around the forever foreigner of Asian Americans, and there are many other racialized archetypes that really feed into settler colonial narratives. And this is why anti-racist work is necessary uh, to work in concert with decolonizing work. The narrative of peaceful, adventurous, virtuous settlement. How do we talk about colonization? How do we codify colonizers? What stories do we continue to tell ourselves about, frontier heroes? These are really important and are often very much around us all the time in a settler colonial state. There are narratives about the supremacy of settlers over indigenous peoples, either through divine or natural order, leaving out, and this is really important, it leaves out the deliberate, calculated nature of the settler colonial project. There are notions that, this was somehow meant to be, that colonialism is excusable because of biology, because of a lack of immunity to European diseases. There are a lot of different narratives that settlers kind of tell themselves in order to justify the colonization of this land. And as settler collectives really start to invest their identity and material belongings into these properties, meaning the land and resources of this land, they're simultaneously creating and empowering a state to defend these properties from indigenous peoples and from indigenous nations, who they see as inherently threatening. So with this, we see the establishment of settler colonial. With the establishment of the settler colonial state, we also see the establishment of the United States Cavalry. We see the establishment of the Royal Mounted Police in Canada and other mounted police forces in Australia. And today, with our police forces, National Guard, private security forces, working for resource extraction companies. Policing is a really big part of the settler colonial project. And in order to protect private property and maintain these colonial structures, the colonial state really has invested in police forces. Slightly connected to this is bureaucratic policing of government agents sent to oversee indigenous peoples forced onto the reservation system. So we see this in the Indian agents that were sent to indigenous territories, preventing people from leaving their reserved land, apprehending children for boarding schools. And this certainly the connections between policing and the settler colonial state run very, very deep. There are also narratives around invisibility, which definitely play into concepts around the 19th century concept of the vanishing Indian, which museums and educational institutions have definitely contributed to and really helped create and shape our modern view of. And I continually run into this narrative in my own work, especially in Maine. Hyper-invisibility of Wabanaki people serves a purpose in this state. And I truly believe that it really allows white Mainers to feel secure in their privilege and to not need to question the structures that are in place currently. A major characteristic of settler colonialism in the United States is based on individual versus the collective. And this is also, they're all important, but this is also a pretty important one, I think. Indigenous nations, for the most part, traditionally held land in common usage as opposed to individual land ownership or title. And the settler colonial project is invested in breaking down that collective. So breaking down that traditional view of land held in common usage. And instead, the settler colonial project is really invested in not only breaking down that collective, but they want to be able to sell land to individuals. For as long as the collective exists, in this case, indigenous nations, it poses a threat to the settler colonial state and to private landholders. And if you look at federal Indian policy in this country, you can see how invested the United States has been in breaking down tribal sovereignty. Whether it was through allotment, termination, or boarding schools for indigenous youth, you can see how invested the United States have been. And if you look even at Maine history, you can also see that same investment in breaking down tribal sovereignty with the vested interest in acquiring more land and more resources. And so much of my work now is really focused on teaching visitors and learners about how pervasive settler colonialism is. And I truly believe that if we can't collectively learn strategies to identify and dig deeper into settler colonialism in our own lives, in our histories, and in our language, then we're failing to do some really meaningful work in our classrooms. The dehumanization of indigenous peoples of this hemisphere is so ingrained that you will need to look at how you've internalized it, how you've normalized it, and develop your own set of tools and resources to utilize in the classroom. And of course, all of this information I've just given you, which is a lot, I know, I've gotten from a variety of different sources. And so please reach out if you would like more readings specifically on settler colonialism and learning more about it. All right, just checking time real quick. Okay, so I make sure. Okay, so I got some time. Um, All right, so how we remember in public is very powerful and it has implications for all of us. Whether we're looking at historical markers or we're thinking about local histories, we can see how colonization has impacted the way in which we remember how we remember and the ways in which Indigenous peoples are seen today. So even locally within our own home communities, these stories of colonial heroism without any recognition of genocide that was perpetrated on this land is memorialized. It's remembered, and we have all these placards and all of these historical societies and small places that really celebrate this version of history. But violence and genocide are intimately tied to the taking of these lands, and they are purposely not mentioned in a lot of ways. The colonial state is invested in telling the story of a virtuous settlement in the face of, quote unquote, hostile native peoples who are resisting that colonialism. The book that I have on screen on the right was actually recommended to me by James Francis of the Penobscot Nation. And I'm also going to recommend it to you because it's a really great place to start if you aren't familiar with the history of the Northeast. But it's a revealing overview of historical accounts that in the territory that we now call New England. And what we find are that many markers in local narratives, and the author is Jean O'Brien, I should mention. But what she really talks about is that many of markers in local narratives in the Northeast note what she calls the first, including the first colonial homes, the first Christian churches, the first white settlements. And then on the flip side, she also makes note of everything of these lastings, right? The last things that are happening in the Northeast. Usually, these are in connection with Indigenous peoples. So there will be historical markers about the last Indian encampment in town, or there will be a historical marker about the last Indian lived in this house, or and there's lots and lots of examples, but the book really highlights how Indigenous peoples are written out of existence in New England, and further highlights the phenomenon of that vanishing Indian, right? That invisibility that's really important to the settler colonial state. And I would argue that there's a really strong foundation right here in the state of Maine around this invisibility. And O'Brien further articulates that the ways in which local histories in the Northeast become um, the primary means for European Americans to own their own modernity by having their firsts in really memorialized, while also denying it to Indigenous peoples. So erasing, then memorializing Native peoples really serves a pragmatic goal within a settler colonial state. By denying the continued existence of Indigenous peoples, the settler society can refute Indian claims to lands and to rights. And at the end of the day, settler colonial narratives don't just surround us, they certainly do, but that's not all they do. They protect and uphold the settler state as a benevolent and as a natural force. Settler colonial narratives protect white people. So in many ways, they aren't just stories and histories, they're intimately tied to the structures that continue to seek to destroy tribal sovereignties. And that's why we must, that's why what we teach matters in the classroom, and that's why all of us have a responsibility. So I'm switching gears just a little bit, but here's an example of some of the work I've had I've had to do to kind of unpack some of my frustrations as a public school teacher working in social studies. And at first, I wasn't really sure why I was getting so frustrated in the classroom. Um, and I knew that something wasn't sitting right with me as I taught curriculum in world history and in American history. And as someone who worked really hard to develop a pedagogical approach that emphasized social justice and anti-racism, I had to start to ask myself some really hard questions about the work I was asking my students to engage in. And I came to the realization that my frustration stemmed from the continued glorification of empire building that was present in the curriculum. You know, I quite literally felt like I was being asked to teach empire after empire after empire without any critical look at the human cost of empire building and the destructiveness that is inherent in empire building. And so my frustrations were very much rooted in the curriculum structure of having empire after empire as a framework to study human history. I was forced to really pause and ask, what would education look like if we didn't utilize this structure? I asked myself how I had normalized this structure in my own education and how I now had a responsibility to address it in my classroom. And in many ways, as I like personally reflect on decolonization, I don't know if we can truly decolonize, like truly decolonize our classrooms and our educational institutions if we continue to only highlight and emphasize empires in world history. Another thing I identified is that the glorification of empire building felt like it was almost it was being portrayed as a natural process. And what I mean by this is that empire building as it exists in our curriculum is really presented as a natural phenomenon in human history that we're not only then and therefore we're not encouraged to question it. And this single narrative tie links centuries worth of human experience and history to the rise and falls of to the rise and fall of empires from every corner of the world. And by this logic, it is so natural that there is no need for us to actually question it. And by extension, our students don't need to question it. And when presented in the classroom, these empires, they do feel, you know, kind of quote unquote like us. So in a world history courses, the rise of the Roman Empire feels like a direct link to the creation of European empires and the creation and glorification of the United States. It feels like the Roman Empire is one of our forebears almost, just as the Greeks were. And the glorified moments of these empires and these histories, you know, somehow they belong to us because we almost are like that next iteration. That's the kind of the story that it feels like we're telling ourselves. Inevitably, this leads to an othering process, though, of those who are conquered by empires. And if we're looking at it, we're not looking at whose lands, labor, and cultures were taken and co-opted for the benefit of empire. Um, and we never get to hear their voices and their perspectives of those peoples that we are othering in this model. So the tools and approaches that I adopted in response were really vital to my work as I continued to navigate an incredibly colonial curriculum, while I simultaneously was working to advocate for decolonizing methodology, which I still get to do today, which I'm really fortunate to be able to do. And some of these strategies do include, interrogating text, visual thinking strategies, modeling the questions and questioning the curriculum itself for students. Of course, strengthening the confidence of students to work with really complex ideas and seeking sources that give voice to those who are silenced in our curriculum. And sometimes when I have time, when I get to do this as a professional development, I'll use different paintings and try to actually go through a visual thinking strategy lesson with teachers. But it really helps. I like to demonstrate how to implement that visual thinking strategies as a way to interrogate texts, and in this case, this painting. But more importantly, I like to demonstrate how we can ask really big questions about the curriculum itself by utilizing art and by utilizing visual thinking strategies. Um, I use this painting and others in my classroom to illustrate how ingrained the celebration of empire is and how the collective we mourns when an empire falls. And this painting in particular was created, centuries after the fall of Rome. Yet the sacking of Rome by the racialized others is memorialized in our collective consciousness. So even in my world history classes, I was really able to question the foundations of empire glorification by creating a personal toolkit of strategies and activities that I felt confident using, and that I hope you'll feel confident using someday, especially now that you're learning a little bit more about settler colonialism and some of those foundations. And here is another example. We have a mural that sits in the United States Capitol. It's titled "Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way." And in it, we see, white Americans, those frontier heroes, on the precipice of creating a vast empire. They are the, quote unquote, we. And as I use this piece, um, as I use this piece with students, I really question how empty those lands are, right? In the background of the painting, you see how empty and vast those lands that are, somehow meant to be colonized. Asking really important questions like that is really vital to this work. Um, and and I like to think about how these images and the narratives and countless others have been really just ingrained within us. Like we're used to seeing these in our government buildings. We're used to seeing these all the time, and yet uh, it's really important for us to actually really take into consideration what's happening when we're looking at these and how they're normalized. The language of empire and settler colonialism are indeed protecting most white people living in the United States because the foundational myths of the creation of this country are all too often never questioned, right? So if we are to look at the truths that Donna was asking us to speak to, I really feel like settler colonialism is one of those truths that we need to start facing and that we need to start talking about amongst ourselves and then within our classrooms. And hopefully, now that you've learned a little more about the key aspects of settler colonialism, you'll be able to see some of those settler narratives that are at play in this mural in particular. And if you have time later, I really do encourage you to look at art such as this and really start to deconstruct those colonial narratives. It's really going to help strengthen those skills that you want to be strengthening. I did want to mention a pretty significant study that the National Museum of the American Indian did on all major textbooks within the United States. Um, And the NMAI, they actually found some disturbing trends regarding Indigenous topics in social studies, which I have listed here. So we have the most common topics that are repeatedly taught within these textbooks, and there's 6 major areas. So we have Jamestown and Pocahontas, Thanksgiving, Sacagawea, the Plains Wars, the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears, Central and South American civilizations, including the Maya, Inca, and Aztec. So arguably, these selected moments in history of this continent actually reveal very little about the lived experiences of indigenous peoples in the Americas. And that's what we should be really concerned about. Is that if our curriculum and what we teach is only hitting on these points, we're missing not only all of Wabanaki history, but we're missing so much more that is happening in American history. And it's leaving out the lived experiences and really beautiful complexities of life that have existed on this land for thousands of generations before colonization even began. And this succession of topics really illuminate the rise of select indigenous societies and then the inevitable fall of those and like supposed disappearance of native peoples. So you really have a lot of like really early content, and then you kind of move through the Plains Wars, and then more of uh, these kind of tragic histories around the Trail of Tears, but nothing is said about contemporary Native peoples. And I think that is really, really important. Another thing I took away while looking at this is that the only civilizations that really are taught throughout the US really come from examples that kind of model that empire building that I was mentioning earlier. So if we're looking at the Maya, Inca, and Aztec, they really do fit into that kind of working theory that I have around um, the only civilizations worthy of study are those that model that empire building. My best advice I can give to educators who want to start thinking about decolonization and preparing for Wabanaki studies is to start to build your toolkit and start preparing through your own education. Um, and I've listed some of my own kind of toolkit things that I've used and I still use in education. Um, the questioning of the legitimacy of colonialism and empire building, the modeling of the questions to create critical thinkers, and utilizing text that you can interrogate, and bringing in, of course, supplementary sources. And when it comes to listening to the voices that have historically been silenced in our classroom, you'll have to really seek out those voices, but they are there. I assure you that they're there. It's been pretty amazing the kinds of voices that you are able to bring out if you really take the time to seek out those voices. Um, and to really bring those narratives to the front and to center those voices. And when we're thinking about Wabanaki studies, we really want to think about centering Wabanaki voices whenever possible. Um, and another really important aspect I have found in my work is the highlighting of resistance and adaptation. So whenever there has been oppression, there have been resistance and strategic adaptation to that oppression. So seek out those stories too, bring them into the forefront. I strongly believe that this is the way that you can humanize the experiences of those that we teach about. And this also allows for incredible opportunities to connect the past to the present. I also made some notes about self-education and understanding that there are a lot of intersections between anti-racism and decolonization, and that you shouldn't choose one for the other, that you should really be thinking about both of them working together to build you a stronger base. And then, of course, another piece of advice is to always build a cohort of educators to help prepare yourselves to advocate later for the implementation of the Wabanaki Studies Law. And I can never leave a group of teachers without mentioning some resources for you. And I kind of ran out of time listing all my normal resources because I was trying to reformat my presentation. But this first resource is from the National Museum of the American Indian. They are really working on overhauling their lessons and resources for educators throughout the United States. And they've developed some really compelling lessons that I want to highlight for you real quickly. They've created these digital lessons that help you formulate really strong questions around important topics in social studies curriculum. They are really good at using primary sources. So if that's something that you're interested in a social studies setting, then I highly recommend that you check it out. It is called Native Knowledge 360, and they're really great about bringing contemporary perspectives and how history is still alive within Indigenous communities and how it's still felt. And here I just have like one example from one of their lessons. They do a really great lesson on removal policy, which is if you're not familiar, a federal Indian policy that sought to remove many Eastern tribes from their lands and to move people to places like the Oklahoma territories. And in this particular lesson, they really seek to move beyond just the example of the Cherokee and look at other groups that have historically been removed from their homelands. And at the top, you can see one of their really compelling questions that they ask. What does it mean to remove a people? Um, and again, they are really good about bringing in voices from the past, and they even have some really great examples of bringing in voices from the present. And of course, we have to talk about colonization in the actual land that we are on right now. And we need to talk about settler colonialism within the state of Maine. And so this is a really good resource. If you're not familiar, there is a teacher's guide that coincides with the documentary, sorry, the film Dawnland. And they've done a really good job with this teacher's guide digging into the history of colonization in the state and nationally, and looking at the impact of federal policies, which have really sought to destroy the foundations of Indigenous communities, and in particular Wabanaki communities within the context of this document. Of this film. So, and if you have not seen Dawnland, I also highly encourage you to seek out that film and watch it. One of their key questions that they use to really frame this teacher's guide is, what is the relationship between the taking of the land and the taking of the children? And it's a really compelling question that I do really love. And so these are the kinds of questions that make my educator heart really happy. um, and I did run out of time to really prepare some good Wabanaki specific slides, but I wanted to give a special shout out to there are educator resources on the Penobscot Nation website that I'd be happy to share with you if you don't already have the link and if you're not able to find them. I also would definitely recommend PassamaquoddyPeople.com if you want some more primary sources for Passamaquoddy history, including audio and video resources. So please reach out to me if you'd like a full list of those resources. I also have a lot of resources on settler colonialism and any other topics that you could possibly hope to ask about. But we are at 10:25 exactly.